Still a bit dehydrated. So what I had intended to talk about today very much pertains to that quote that of that Nilanjan shared with us from the current president of the United States, in which this is a manifestation of a long history of violence, war and violence that the United States has been carrying out in the service of the military-industrial complex, in the sense that it has always acted in the service of imperial rule from the United States. And not just the United States, but largely in the service of capitalism and largely in the service of sustaining capital class rule. What I had hoped to talk about more in detail was how this pertains to Palestine. Palestine is one of my major preoccupations, and of course, given the last 21 months or so, there's very little that I probably need to tell this audience about what's going on in Palestine, particularly in Gaza, although the West Bank is on the receiving end of very serious more settler violence over the last couple of months as well, although that's been underreported. But what I was wanting to bring about is what I often am invested in is what's called a world systems analysis. Now that comes out of people like Emmanuel Wallerstein. There's some connections as well to Samir Amin and others who have talked about kind of the relationship between development in an economic sense. I'm going to put development in quotes because I hate that term, but I'm going to put it in quotes anyway. And the relationship to dispossession. And of course, if we go far enough back, we understand that one of the ways in which global processes of power are brought together are through myriad relationships of dispossession, right? So every time there's sort of wealth and accumulation happening somewhere, it occurs as a product of dispossession somewhere else, right? And particularly, again, in the service of capital growth and the extraction of surplus. Okay, so that's the theoretical stuff. It has a long trajectory going back to Marx, but doesn't end with Marx, or doesn't it has taken various forms over the last 130 years or so. But one thing to say is that this is a way in which, if anyone has ever had the pleasure of reading Mahmoud Mamdani's book, Neither Settler Nor Native, this is what he describes as colonial modernity. This is what brings the world together through various processes of ethnic cleansing, dispossession, displacement. And so throughout the world of sort of contemporary Palestinian literature, we can find an index of all of these processes, that neither of these different texts that I would be interested in talking about, where for example, Ghassan Kanafani's novella called Returning to Haifa, in which the book talks about the period between the 1948 Nakba and the 1967 Naksa, which were two very key moments in modern Palestine history and the thing that entrenched the apartheid state that they have since lived in. These are also, manifestations of patterns of displacement, the totality of capitalism, the totality of the way in which this kind of imperial rule entrenches itself and how it is felt among those who are receiving its worst effects. In a more contemporary sense, we might think of novels that also call upon ecological and environmental concerns, and how this pertains to the damage inflicted upon nature and inflicted upon animals, and how this interacts with a sense in which a cultural memory of a people and of their land is tied in with the catastrophes of ecological devastation. Yeah, and these again, if we take a lot of ideas that come out of the Jason Moore and the idea of the capitalist scene. We've seen this a lot as well. I know last time we talked about Amitav Ghosh. Actually, we've talked about Amitav Ghosh several times, Dylan John, haven't we? Also, as someone who writes very carefully about these kinds of things, the way in which environment and climate change is inextricable from forces of capital accumulation. And what I would say is that this process, as we learn from Marx, from Rosa Luxemburg, from Emmanuel Wallerstein, from Samir Amin, all these people teach us that this cannot exist without attending violence. Violence of dispossession has to bring this world system into its current form. And it can only exist this way. In the extraction of surplus, the stealing of territory, the breaking of indigenous social relations has to occur through violence. Marx very well understood this. He was updating Adam Smith's thesis that this was just, a natural manifestation of, by dint of their genius and whatever. Marx said, no, this has to be through violence. It couldn't be any other way. Rosa Luxemburg imposed the idea that this is through militarism. That's how accumulation achieves. And so what I've often been insisting upon for quite a long time now is that Palestine and Palestinian literature in particular gives us the most clear representation and a very instructive way of looking at how all of these forces of violence come together through military, through settlement, through occupation, and through the advancement of corporate power, surveillance power. Palestinian literature gives us all of this, and if had I the physical and mental capacity, I would elaborate on more detail in different novels and how they are constructed in this way. I'll just give one example that's off the top of my head. Is a novel by Susan Abu Hawa called The Blue Between Sky and Water. This is a novel where both the form of this novel is a magic realist novel. And so we're asked to treat these kinds of supernatural, if you like, or if you like fantastical elements as a kind of banality. And what they offer, however, is an insight that cannot otherwise be described in the more conventional realist narrative devices, but in turn, because these are characters having to cope with the loss of self, the loss of land, the loss of memory, what emerges is a renewed sort of way of processing violence, including the interaction between, in the case of that novel, it's the continuities between sexual violence, military violence, and violence inflicted upon the environment. All three of these are continuous with each other in a text with one another in a text like that. Another book would be Mornings in Jenin, also by Susan Abu Hawa, in which we're talking about a multi-generational family. But at the center of that novel is, if you're familiar with Palestinian literature, you'll already know this, but it's the olive tree, which plays a very significant symbolic role in Palestinian literature, which it comes to symbolize in the Palestinian tradition, the idea of sumud. And sumud means a kind of steadfastness, a kind of ability to withstand in the face of ongoing aggression. And the olive tree is a central kind of central point at which this family both identifies itself through the land that was stolen, but also one character in the novel, a character named Amal, really does exhibit exactly that kind of steadfastness. And it's no accident that every time she's described on the very same terms as if, these olive trees that have to withstand various different environmental changes, but they have to be They have to be tended to very actively and with very specific methods. And she's described by her stubbornness. She's described by her sort of ornery determination, as she's described. So what I was always interested in is how all of this teaches us something very important about global international processes. That, of course, doesn't mean we all experienced violence the same way. It doesn't mean that we all experience class power in the same way. It means that these things connect the world, but they affect it in unequal, in uneven ways. Yeah. So this is very important. I'm not talking about globalization. I'm not talking about the idea that, it's a sea that lifts all boats, and we've all had that god-awful book by Thomas Friedman where he talks about the world is flat and it has created equalities of wealth and access to wealth for everyone. I don't think anybody listening to me now believes that that's true for even a second. But what I would say is that it helps us understand the dialectical relationship between development and underdevelopment. Right? That's one way that we understand. If you've read Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, you know that this has a long-standing history of understanding what colonial modernity did to the global South in order to achieve and arrive and to secure wealth for Europe and North America. So these are processes that bring the world together, but not as if they are all the same, because not all processes of class rule are experienced the same. That's absolutely true, and everyone knows this. And that these can't be sort of talked about on universal terms. It has to be a negotiation between the particular and the universal. But it does also, and one last thing that I will say before, because I'm starting to get a bit exhausted already, is it does challenge some of the ideas that we've all inherited in post-colonial theory, because it doesn't insist, for example, upon incommensurabilities across territory and across power, and it does still understand that there needs to be an understanding that at some level capital has generalized. It hasn't, I'll just repeat again, it hasn't generalized on universal in the sense that everyone feels its generalization the same way, but capital has not stopped moving to every corner of the earth. And I think the idea of insisting upon a cultural particularity that is isolated and atomized doesn't quite work in how we understand the capitalist law of motion. And this is where the concept of world literature, as I would conceive of it, and which I inherit from the Warwick Research Collective. If anyone is familiar with the Warwick Research Collective, they insist upon how literature maps onto this world system and how it allows us to be attentive to global and international processes of movement and territoriality and dispossession. So that's, I think that's everything that I can muster without having a proper script. And I apologize if any of it was if it was too incoherent to follow, but I'm happy to do my best to answer questions.
Yeah, I think that is better. Maybe we can, if we can ask questions. Sharnoda will be asking you questions. So, but Kevin, one thing is this: that whenever you feel uncomfortable, please tell us. We will let you off. That very moment.
Okay.
Okay, please tell us. So,
thank you very much.
Sharnoda, please.
Yeah. You had, as you just said, that you feel that you have been incoherent, but trust me, this is perhaps the best response that we can actually extend to this incoherent time of ours. So, I mean, feel absolutely perfectly all right. The way you have spoken, you have actually touched upon all the points that we need to really ponder upon and cogitate upon. It was a short address for sure. As you said, it was unscripted, but boy, how we got enriched by that. All I can say is that I've taken down notes. I'm sure that we'll be having a longer session on this sometime in the future. But I mean, we have managed to really get hold of those points, those nuanced spaces of violence which are being perpetrated and worse still, pushed into anonymity. As you said, underreporting is the word of the day. And we are being subjected to that. And as we, collectively move towards a sort of amnesia, that is perhaps the worst kind of violence that can be perpetrated on humanity proper. So if there is any question from anyone of us present here, may request Professor Devolina to come up with her observations on this presentation of Kevin.
I think Falguni has a question. Yeah, Falguni has a question.
All right. Falguni, please.
It's a very it's a very ethical question. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
So who is responsible? Yeah, just a second.
Sure.
Unmute yourself. And Devolina, you can frame the question in the meantime.
Okay, hello, hi.
Hi.
So my question is, actually, it's a bit tough question for me to answer myself. That is, who is actually responsible for the violence, and can this violence really be stopped in future?
Mm. Yeah.
And I want to say something that is, I think it cannot be, because the root cause is our greed.
Well, thank you for the intervention. Or should we take several questions before I answer, or do you want me to answer each one at a time?
Yeah, the one at a time. Yeah, but
however the way you
won't
feel
ask
like.
too many
One at
questions.
a time.
Yeah. I'm thankful for this question. It's as you can probably guess, it's not an easy one to answer. What I forgive me if I'm gonna sound like I'm a broken record, because I'm gonna repeat something I sort of hinted at, which is the reason I insist on a materialist analysis is that it offers us more clarity than trying to assign blame to a particular person. And I understand that can be very frustrating. It's frustrating for me too, because you want to hold people accountable and you want to challenge the people who are perpetrating violence. But when you take a materialist approach through a Marxist lens, what you find instead is that it's a system and it's not a particular person. And that means that the challenge where you can apply pressure isn't through. I think we have well figured out now. If we just focus on Gaza, and we'll see throughout all of our lives that it won't just be. Unfortunately, it's going to be affecting all of us very soon, and it's heartbreaking that it has to be affecting all of us. But we're going to see very quickly that international law, criminal courts, UN resolutions, they're not going to do anything. I know that sounds cynical, and I know that sounds fatalistic, but history has shown us that these are manifestations of a system, of which the people acting in the service of that system are merely just products of it. They're also alienated to it. Yeah. So my point is, if we want to apply pressure, we have to apply it where the actual levers of power are, and those have to be not the people who are subjecting us to, whether it's wage slavery, whether it's to displacement, whether it's to ethnic cleansing. It's not people doing it, because we can't just remove one bad person from leadership and expect the next person who's going to come in to change everything. I think we all know this, right? So the idea of also saying, I think I understood you to say, I think it's greed at the end of the day. I would push back on that a little bit, right? Because again, it's not as if I were to take out Jeff Bezos as the CEO of Amazon, and I put someone someone there who was someone who said, I'm interested in giving away all of my half of my income to charity and all of that, that person would still be beholden to their stockholders. They would still be beholden to the market forces that demand that they continue to expand and monopolize and pursue labor-saving technology and steal all of our data because it has to. That's the nature of the system. I'll give one example of this. This was reported on many, many years ago, but in fact, I recently looked it up. You can find it in some newspapers during George W. Bush's presidency. That's how long ago this would have been. When a group of oil executives wrote a letter to George W. Bush, and they said, listen, we need you to regulate us. We need you to put a cap on carbon emissions because the market is telling us we can't. So we need the government to come in and do something about it. That meant that all of these executives were saying, we want to do the right thing, but the market is telling us we have to do something else. Basically, the letter was, stop us before we kill again. Because we can't do anything by it. This is the lesson we get when you take a materialist analysis. I want to say all of these people are evil. And I have a lot of fun saying all of these people are evil. All of these people are greedy. They're all going to run us off the planet. But I know deep in my heart that it makes no difference whether any of these people are nice, whether any of these people think they're doing a good thing or a bad thing, because the system will dictate where this goes. But the good thing is if we understand that, then we know how to fight it. And we know we have to fight it not by teaching people to be good, because I think we all believe we want to teach people to be good. We wouldn't be educators otherwise. But I think what we really need to do is say, where are the pressure points of this system? How can we apply real pressure to it? So that's why when it comes to Palestine, I mean, that's why the boycott movement has been such a boycotts are not always successful. They're usually a last-ditch effort if you know anything about sort of labor organizing. But it has worked. Divestment movements have worked. And they have shown to work way better than any of us wagging our finger at Netanyahu saying, you need to stop killing all the people in Gaza. Clearly that hasn't worked. The International Court of Justice is right there saying, what are you waiting for? Call a ceasefire. But he's not subject to that. He's subject to the system of the military-industrial complex. Obviously, largely supported by the United States, but that itself is in the service of military contractors that say this is the most profitable year on record for us. Right? That's a system. That's not any one person. If we replace Netanyahu for someone else, they're going to be subject to the dynamics of settler colonialism, which is rife with all of these contradictions that cannot break unless they break the system of settler colonialism to which the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine are subject. I say that I know that's not a nice answer. I know we want to say, how do we hold people responsible? We all want to hold people responsible, but my indictment is the system, unfortunately.
Thank you. That was a very insightful answer. And yes, that actually forces us to take the entire spectrum of the network of power into question, into consideration. Professor Devulin Udash, you may come up with your observation or question, please.
Wonderful session. So I just have one question. So we've seen that in the Israeli settler project, or even in any colonial settler project, so subjects, in this case Palestinians, they are rendered as a surplus population, to use a Marxist term. So they are people who are excluded from the labor value and citizenship, yet ironically, they are managed by technologies of the state, surveillance, imprisonment, humanitarian aid. So, in light of this, how do Palestinian resistance movements, armed, cultural, or intellectual, how can they enact forms of class consciousness or anti-capitalistic praxis?
Mm. Once again, oh man, these very challenging questions. I really love it. I could feel myself getting energy back. I haven't had questions like these in a while. How can they achieve class consciousness? Well, my answer to that is, again, one of the problems that is a contradiction of settler colonialism is, without there having ever been a sufficient process of land reform in a place like Palestine, we won't have class consciousness. Now, that isn't to say that we need to be doomed to say it could never happen. What it means is, where Palestine exists within this broad structure of class rule and dispossession, it's not a universally proletarianized population. As you said, it's much more of a excluded. I mean, to use to use a Marxist term, we would maybe say the industrial reserve army, which is those who are outside of the traditional system of wage labor, but who are used in nevertheless to beat back worker solidarity. Specifically in Palestine, since 1948, they've been permanent refugees, right? And as in terms of refugee status, that means that their connection to state protection, labor protections, are completely dissolved because of their like what we might say as like an in-between status, or we might say an exterior status, or as a permanently expelled people. That therefore the analysis has to take account of the fact that there has never been a process whereby systems of land reform could make it possible to create a coherent worker identity, or a coherent worker formation, to use a more technical term, right? So this sense of class consciousness, in which people achieve the idea of a class for itself, right? A class acting in the solidarity against the forces of capital. I would submit that for that to occur for somewhere like Palestine, there needs to be a project in which there is a restoration of land given over, if you like, to the indigenous community. We saw this in places in Latin America a lot. So the reason why there's a coherent left movement, such as it is, it's not perfect, but that there is a coherent worker movement in places like Brazil, is because there was a project of land reform. It was incomplete, but at least started. In other places in Latin America, there was a huge land reform project. For that matter, if I could make an equivalent case, I mean, in the United States as well, we never had a sufficient land reform movement either in the United States. So I should say I live in Vienna, but I'm from the United States, so I don't know if the audience knows this about me. Maybe you can tell by my accent. But in the United States, we also never had a land reform movement, and which is also why we don't have a real left in the United States. There's a reason why also the continuities between settler colonialism and neoliberalism go so hand in hand, because maintaining the very same dynamics of managing a surplus population are the same things that settler colonialism adheres to and neoliberalism adheres to. And so without that process, where the indigenous people could have any kind of restored common access to and common control over land, is why there is no coherent left movement. And particularly in Palestine as well. I mean, we could talk about the fact that there was a distinct effort. Sarah Roy wrote a very classic book about this in the 1990s called The De-Development of Gaza. And she insists on the phrase de-development instead of underdevelopment, because this was a process in which what was the advances in infrastructure and technology in Gaza were systematically destroyed by Israel in order to de-develop them. I mean, and that was a policy. That was an explicit Israeli policy of de-development. But that process itself is designed with the explicit goal of ensuring that there will not be a labor movement, because there can't be, as long as you've systematically de-developed and systematically also destroyed capital-intensive industries. This is where the people of Palestine are dependent upon surrounding labor markets, including in Israel, but not exclusively, right? In Jordan and Lebanon and other places. They're dependent upon surrounding labor markets, making it so that there cannot be a unified labor movement within Palestine. And that's by design. That's what settler colonialism is. That's what Zionism is, actually. Zionism historically was always an anti-socialist movement. It systematically destroyed even the Jewish socialist movements, both in the Middle East and in Europe. That was its design. That was its goal. And ever since, it has acted in the service of creating the domination of a ruling class so that there cannot be a proper coherent class formation. So so just to sum up, without land reform, without an internationalist type of labor movement, and without the possibility of, again, I'm putting it in quotes, development to counteract the processes of de-development, those would be the things that would, in my mind, be required in order to ensure a coherent labor movement and class consciousness.
Thank you, Kevin. That was very insightful.
Yeah. Right. So can I ask a question? I mean, Kevin, one more question. I mean, if your health permits, that is.
Yes, I can.
So can I shout another?
Oh, please. But if Kevin feels all right, then I do have my own observations. So if that can be accommodated, Kevin, please see to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Sharnoda will be coming up with the last words. So, me and my brother Falguni over here, we have this kind of chit chat over these sessions. So, I mean, what I want to ask you is this, that, if there is the ethnic cleansing and the total mass destruction of Gaza, which is happening obviously through America and through Israel. America mainly, and through Israel. Through Israel, America is conducting that. But on the other side of it, you also have an October 7th, where Hamas had, attacked Israel and the citizens of Israel. I think quite a few hundred and thousands of people were killed. It's not just about the October 7th, but quite a few, and this is the same thing, I guess, in all the conflict zones. So how do you look at this interface of violence? And do you think that there is an issue of disproportionality over there as well? So that's my question.
Yeah, it's a great question and a very important one, because I don't want to give too much of a simplistic dichotomy of saying that there's a sort of permanent unilateral sense of violence. I would say that when it comes to the events of October 7th, we really have to take we have to take a long historical view of this. Where does Hamas come from? Hamas emerged in the late 1980s as a group that, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, an offshoot as well of Hezbollah. They were very still in close collaboration with Hezbollah, both as products of two very important things. One being the fact that the PLO was permanently shattered in the early 1980s by Israel and the United States. Let's say not shattered, but severely damaged. And what we understand about moments like this in history is that where there is domination, there is resistance, right? Where there is oppression, there is resistance. It is well known, and if you want a great book on this, I'd recommend Nora Erakat's book called Justice for Some, this is where she points out that it is written in international law. And again, we have to take with a grain of salt that international law can't manage everything. But if you maintain an illegal occupation on a people, and in the case of Palestine, it's been an illegal occupation for more than half a century, then you relinquish any claim to safety for both your state and for your citizens and for your civilians. And now, I'm not saying that to justify the acts of October 7th. I think they were horrific. I think they were careless. I think it was clear that it was carried out without any real plan. Although some have said that, oh, they had been planning this for a year or years or something, but it's really not sure. It's not really clear to me that it had a real goal in mind. They had said, well, leading up to this, there had been normalization between Israel and the Arab states, but they sidelined Palestine again. They cited that for a reason. They called it the Operation Al-Aqsa Flood in reference to the idea that the Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem is relentlessly subject to pogroms and fire bombings. So they had reasons. But whether they had a goal in mind is to me a total mystery. And it's unfortunate because that has created a system of, of permanently having to navigate these complexities. But what I do know is that the claim that Israel has a right to defend itself, to me, doesn't quite work when they have been occupying a people illegally for over 60 years. It doesn't quite work for me if they have also been, if they turned Gaza into an open-air prison. They have laid siege to them in the early 2000s. Hamas, whether we like it or not, and we may not like it, but it's not our business, they won the election in 2000. They won the election in 2005. We may not like it, but it happened. And that election was seen as legitimate. The United States tried to carry out a coup against Hamas. It didn't work. They failed because Hamas was popular at the time. And as a result of that, Israel laid siege to them. They put an endless blockade on Gaza. They basically pulled out all of their settlements. And a lot of people think that that meant that Israel relinquished control of Gaza. That's not true. They removed settlements because it made it easier for them to maintain the most punishing surveillance regime possible on Gaza and to turn it into basically an enclave of punishment and collective punishment on a people for daring to elect a party that no one else, that Israel doesn't like. That's the end of it. Now, Hamas, a lot of people don't know, had made several reforms to their own platform. I find it interesting that many people conveniently forget that in 2021, Hamas agreed to a two-state resolution on the 1967 lines. That was a huge compromise. That was a compromise that most people in Palestine were not ready to accede to. But they did it in 2021. That went completely unnoticed by the EU, the United States, most of the media around in the global north completely ignored this. All they know is, and most of what people remember, is the Second Intifada, in which, yes, that was the era of suicide bombings. Yes, that was the era of child soldiers being recruited into Hamas. That happened. I can't deny that happened. It did happen. And that's why most people associate Hamas with terror and anti-Semitism. But the broad history we have to take, as Frantz Fanon teaches us, this kind of resistance is going to happen when you have been occupying a people. And the only way to challenge colonial rule the only way to challenge occupation was going to be through violence. Now, I question a lot of the sort of, let's say, the Islamic fundamentalism of Hamas. I would question how much how little emphasis they put on a class internationalist movement. Again, going back to the previous question. But this is what happens when you maintain an illegal occupation. And yes, the response to Hamas has been catastrophically disproportionate because they're not going after military targets. They're trapping people in food aid centers and shooting them dead. They're killing children. They're starving people. That is not a reaction and going against military targets. They're going after hospitals and lying about the fact that those hospitals are covered from military holdouts. They're lying about the food aid centers being Hamas operations. And what's one final point on this? We have to remember that Hamas is the local civil or civic organization of Gaza. Again, whether we like it or not. They have an armed wing. They also have the wing that is responsible for setting school curricula. They have a wing that is responsible for provision of food. They have to work with UNRWA. They have to. And they have to work with organizations that are involved in provisions. They're the ones that determine when people's trash gets picked up. They're involved in all of these things. Israel has conveniently been able to go after all of these other institutions, all of these civic institutions, by saying that they're run by Hamas. Well, of course they are. Hamas is the local government. Who do you think sets it in any municipality in the world? Every municipality is run by the local party that won the election. And so Israel gets to get away with this by saying they're run by Hamas. The Hamas health ministry. Yeah, of course, they're the Hamas-run Gaza health ministry. It's the local government that is governing. So we have to be very clear about this. And by still saying stochastic violence is horrific and it affects civilians, but that's what happens as it's written in international law. That's what happens when you maintain an illegal occupation. You abrogate any claims to safety for your own civilians and for your own territorial integrity. All of these things are relinquished when you maintain conditions like this.
I mean, this once again, this reply of yours, this elaborate reply of yours, Kevin, once again re-emphasizes on the fact that we stay informed, we analyze, we go deep into the issues that are being catered to us in a very scanty manner, and we are never allowed to get into the details of it. Just one last question before we let you go, Kevin. Here, I mean, you have been talking about pressure points and the failures of them, like the very important organizations that we have set up post the disasters of Second World War, the UN, the International Court of Justice, and they are once again failing terrifically, if I may say that. I mean, the latest maybe the US Congress itself, the way Mr. Trump has now boasted that it is responsible for bombarding certain Iranian bases. That means the US has gone to war. And this is a statement issued by none other than the President of the United States. But there is no, resolution adopted in the Congress. I mean, this makes George Bush the senior appear angelic. At least he took the permission of the Congress before he went into the war. He lied, but then again, he took the permission. So these pressure points are falling apart. And, the pressure points within us, if we turn that a little, into an intimate space of our personal emotions, I believe in my country, those pressure points of my perception as an individual, as a community, they're failing as well. we are getting information, for example, about children getting killed indiscriminately, and how we see that that is not creating any ripples for the majority of at least the netizens. I mean, they are also voicing the same terrific, terrible, terrible opinion that, okay, fine, they would grow up and they would grow up to be Hamas, they would grow up to be terrorists. So better eliminate them, nip them in the bud. I mean, how can we be so crass about this entire genocide of children? This kind of makes me wonder whether there is a certain negotiation that is going on between the pressure points of the macro politics and the failure of the pressure points within us, the human individuals. I'd like to listen to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's I think it's a great question. I think you've sort of already anticipated my answer as well, because I think one of the things that will always make these you know, I'll say a little bit that, I live in Austria. Austria lives with the painful legacy of the Holocaust, the painful legacy of anti-Semitism. And what I notice here is the inability, it seems, of not just to sort of reconcile two truths existing at once, and the reconciliation of the fact that these are contradictory forces that have to, at the end of the day, conform to broader systems that are unfortunately bigger than any one of us individually. They're not bigger than us as a collective, but they are bigger than any one of us individually. And I think that's very hard for all of us to process and get used to as a way of thinking. Trump bypassing Congress in order to bomb Iran. I mean, when I see things, when this kinds of stuff happens, I mean, again, my formative years were the invasion of Iraq, when I achieved my political consciousness, and I permanently couldn't trust my home government ever again. And these are the kinds of things that you just go, but what can you do? What are you going to do about it? I mean, the way that we should learn permanently, and there are some places around the world, I think, that have much more, certainly not in my home country, but in other places, people have much more willingness to never trust their own governments because they know their governments are never going to work on their behalf. Because our governments are, in the state institutions, the UN, the International Criminal Court, they can do whatever they want. They can try all they want. But the existence of something like the Security Council, the existence of executive orders and consolidation of executive powers in the presidency in the United States, it just means that our political leaders are laughing at us. They really are. They're really looking at us and going, "Oh, you don't want us to go to war? We'll do it anyway. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to cry about it? Are you going to do something about it? Are you going to complain about it?" And the issue is we cannot internalize that message too much. Okay? We have to understand that there are more of us than there are of them. And all we have is each other. We don't have our governments. We can't count on them. We have each other. And all we have is each other. And if we lose sight of that, we are doomed. We have to understand that we have each other. We have to protect. There's more. I think I even said this during the last lecture 4 years ago. There's more distance between me and my government than there is between me and every one of you. Right? We are closer to each other than any of us are to our own governments. And that includes the UN, that tries to be this international organization that tries to bring the world together in peaceful harmony. We've seen that can't exist when there's governments with nuclear arsenals and they have veto power. The United States has veto power in the UN and uses it relentlessly. So much for this international community. But we also know that there are more countries in the global south existing in the UN that if they had their say, they would completely topple US military hegemony. So we have to have a Security Council to maintain the position of the ruling class, right? So they're laughing at us, but we can laugh back, and we can laugh louder, and we can do this collectively. If we lose sight of our collective power, then it's over. And so we cannot lose sight of that. That's where the pressure points in ourselves. We have to remember who we are collectively, that our governments are not us. And that's it. That's where the pressure points can be, and that's where we have to sustain our fortitude.
Thank you. Thank you. On that reassuring note, on that very message of our staying together, thicker than ever, I guess, Niranjan, with your permission, we should let Kevin go this time. I mean, it's been really sweet in spite of being under weather. He stayed back.
Yeah.
He delivered a wonderfully engrossing lecture and attended to all our queries.
Thank you very much. I apologize for not being in my full capacity, but
thank you, Kevin. I don't know how to say. No. You have actually surpassed your capacity. In fact, you said that you will be here for 10 minutes, and you are already here for 50 minutes. So that's 5x. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I mean, I can't thank you enough. Thank you, comrade. And from this Politburo, I think we have to take a leave now. But thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. I'm glad I managed to muster the energy. So thank you all for the time. Yeah.